last semester, but okay, hold on. Video, where are you? There we go. Okay. Right, so we ended here last time. The next section is on the economy because, that was kind of the main focus during the 20s, was the economy growing rapidly and kind of without any sort of regulation, which we're going to see is going to cause trouble. So, early in the 20s, there was the turmoil, there was the kind of the falling off of the economy early on because, immediately after a huge war like that, the economy does have to switch from military production back to civilian production, and it does cause a slump. But between 1922 and 1927, the economy did grow pretty rapidly, 7% a year, which was the largest rate during peacetime up to that point in American history. So I'd say they were doing pretty well. Government officials were aligning with big businesses, stimulating economic growth even more, and the book says this created a sort of second industrial revolution, which, as a European historian, the second industrial revolution happened in like the 1800s, but whatever. Don't worry about it. I guess it's a second industrial revolution for the United States. Warren G. Harding became president in 1920, wanted to restore normalcy. He and his party wanted less government and business and more business and government because, that can't ever cause any trouble. Under Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, lower taxes on the wealthy because this would allow them to expand production and create more jobs because, when the wealthy aren't taxed, they definitely do more with their money as opposed to sending it to offshore bank accounts and hoarding it like dragons. Or spending it on stupid stuff. Hey, look, Herbert Hoover's back, and now he's the Secretary of Commerce. Again, if we had if this was a class where I had like an entire year, we would just have a bingo card with Herbert Hoover and like all the different jobs he had. So now he's Secretary of Commerce. He was weakening unions by encouraging voluntary cooperation between government and business, the American Plan, established health insurance and pension plans through the government. So it's Herbert Hoover's fault that you have to have a full-time job in order to have affordable insurance. So thanks, Hoover. Used to be you'd get it through labor unions, but now you basically have to have a full-time job with a business that actually can afford to do that. Because like if you have a job through a small business, your insurance is going to be garbage because the business can't afford decent insurance. Which if you go to like some massive corporation, typically they can afford better insurance. So, thanks, Hoover. Obviously, all this collusion between government and business led to all kinds of corruption. The list would take us the rest of the semester, but the biggest scandal was the Teapot Dome scandal. Teapot Dome was this nature reserve, and the government officials gave out land to the Mammoth Oil Company in exchange for under-the-counter cash, which, for one, you're not supposed to give out land from a nature preserve to oil companies to begin with, but they were doing it in such a way that it wouldn't be on the books, which is all kinds of illegal, and they were found out, and it was a whole big thing. So here's Warren G. Harding and his little bow tie. Here's Andrew Mellon and his very 19th century mustache. Looks very tired. Here's Herbert freaking Hoover again. Probably like listening in on someone's phone call. Which that would have been when he was in the FBI. Here we have some more propaganda. American prosperity, yada yada. It's the American way, freedom, opportunity, private enterprise, representative democracy. You know, everything's great. We'll just ignore here in just a few years when there's people like lined up in front of that thing in a bread line trying to survive. Here we have the American plan arguing against using the labor unions for insurance and pension plans. They're saying that these are threat and intimidation, and they're un-American, autocratic, et cetera, et cetera. There's the oil scandal. Yeah, again, just going back to the union thing. Unions, again, have been maligned from the start in the United States, and again, to this day, in a lot of places are borderline illegal. Like they can't be made illegal, but they're treated in such a way that you would think they were illegal. Or Teapot Dome stuff. Now, that's all the big governmental shenanigans going on. But percentage-wise, when it comes to the American economy, the government really only has so much power. I mean, sure, they are the government, but it's really the population's buying habits that shift the economy. So, wage earners started making a little bit more money. Average purchasing power increased about 20%. And this wasn't just that they were making more money, but that the increased technological innovation made things cheaper. The big deal was the assembly line, which has been kind of in place since like the Renaissance at least. If you took my 103 class, we briefly mentioned in Venice they had like an assembly line for warships. So like assembly lines have existed, just not in their present state. And it was Henry Ford that perfected the assembly line and used it to create the Model T. Henry Ford did not invent the car, for the love of God. If you say that Henry Ford invented the car, I can't take off extra points on the test, but I will want to. And he also did not invent the assembly line. He just used the concept of the assembly line with the automobile, because it used to be you built the automobile by hand one at a time, and that was extremely time-consuming, extremely labor-intensive, and therefore the cars were very expensive and very rare. However, using the assembly line, the production was faster, it was cheaper, and at its height, he was producing a new car every minute from his factories. So, yeah, the cost dropped pretty substantially. Whoops, I just smacked the hell out of my mic. Sorry, online people. Now, automobiles are the most visible of these changes, but as far as like the overall economy, the mass production of the so-called luxury goods were also very important. And as we're going to see, getting into the Great Depression after we do the test, were kind of a bigger deal. So electricity was going into more and more homes. Time-saving products were sought after. Refrigerators, toasters, vacuum cleaners, radios were the norm in the middle class. In fact, just to get ahead of things a little bit, radios are going to become even more prevalent in the Great Depression, because while people don't have a whole lot of money, a radio is going to be something that you're going to want to at least have in your house to be able to listen to the news or to music, just something to get by during the day. Now, cars were still the most important product. It certainly was pushing the most money, and people were typically able to afford them. Sales soared from 1.5 million to 5 million. Americans were able to commute to work, take long-distance vacations, and even changed how courtship worked, because used to be the man had to go to the woman's house when she was still living with her parents, and they were watched like hawks by the angry parents the entire time. Considering how weird my ex-in-laws used to be, it felt like I was living before cars existed. So yeah, I understand how that used to be. And while typically people could afford a lot of this new stuff, there was so much of it happening at the same time that there was now a new system of credit where you could, buy now, pay later, which couldn't cause any kind of issues in the future. Buy things on credit and just pay for it later, no problem. We have a assembly line here. I don't know if this is specifically Ford, but it's these are engine blocks being put together. Each person puts in a specific, what is that? Okay, hopefully I'm not dying. Each person puts in like a specific part of the engine. I'm pretty sure that's a Model T chassis, just based on the wheels. This is not a Model T assembly line, as you can see. In fact, this is much further in the future. But it's still the same idea of you, in fact, I'd say like all car factories today are assembly lines. And then you've got the luxury goods, stoves, lights. I'm not sure if that's specifically a coffee pot or just like a, oh, I lost the name. It's just the thing that boils water. Kettle, there we go. Iron, radio, etc. More stuff from just like a Sears catalog. Just a bunch of lights. 75-cent for a little bulb there. Oh, I wanted to include this one because my grandmother actually had this, and my parents still have it, and it still runs. It's an old-ass refrigerator. The thing there at the top is the actual like refrigeration unit, and it cools the. It's basically like a not a vault, a safe. How thick this thing is, and yeah, it still works. I think we had to replace the actual latch here because it finally started to give out after like 70 years. But yeah, it's a good. It's a GE product that actually still works. There's my Model T. As I told my class yesterday, if I was more into cars, I could probably tell you exactly what type of Model T this was. Or if it was perhaps not even a Model T, like a Model A or something, I don't know. But I don't. I know this one is specifically the one that, this is at the Biltmore Mansion. This is the one that Vanderbilt's wife drove. She really liked to get in her car and just drive around on her own, and they've preserved it and kept it at Biltmore. So if you ever go to Biltmore, you can see this. Okay, now, with the economy growing, obviously the people who were already rich continue to get richer, while those at the bottom tended to stay at the bottom. Many workers were still living below the poverty line. Obviously, the farmers were hit the worst because with most of this being industry, farmers weren't especially helped by it. And again, it seems like whenever industry comes to the farms, it ends up hurting the farmers. Top 1% of families had greater income than the 42% at the bottom. The book actually has a graph that's showing similar percentages here. Now, just ignoring the wealth disparity, just ignoring like what that means for people in America where a few families own more than almost half of everybody else in America. For the economy as a whole, that's not great. Because that means that a large number of people couldn't actually afford the luxury goods, and the people who could afford them could only really buy so much. So like, you know, if you're selling cars, the 42% at the bottom probably couldn't afford one, and the 1% at the top only need, I threw out a number yesterday for my class, maybe 3 if they were feeling like really spunky. It's like, we want one really fancy one for driving around and showing off. We want a fast one that would go all of like 30 miles an hour. And maybe if we live in the countryside, we'd want one that's a bit more rough and tumble, some kind of like off-road style vehicle, which, you know, back then would, I don't know even what that would look like. But that's maybe 3 for 1% of these families. And yeah, you would have sold probably your 3 most expensive cars, but you're not selling to the majority of families because these are luxury goods. These are goods they don't have to have. So that's not great for the economy as a whole. And those at the top were usually putting their money in risky stock investments, which were great. They'd buy their stock on margin, only had to pay a fraction of the cost up front, so if it fell through, then things were bad. It's kind of the what happened with the whole, that weird GameStop thing. A bunch of weirdos saw that GameStop was falling through, so they bought a bunch of stuff on margin to make money, and then a bunch of dudes on Reddit started putting money into it to make the cost go up, and it destroyed a bunch of venture capitalists. It was pretty funny. Real estate speculation became a thing. People were buying up land in Florida without even going to look at the land. And then storms in 1926 and 1928 caused a whole lot of damage and caused land values to plummet, so a bunch of people lost a bunch of money. Can you imagine big storms happening in Florida? It just doesn't seem like something that would happen. And then internationally, things were about the same. We were the world's leading creditor, but European countries owed much of their $11 billion to America, and they relied on Germany to make reparations, but Germany's economy was destroyed in the war. So you can't really rely on a country that has basically been destroyed to pay you $11 billion so that you can pay off your debt to another country. So Charles Dawes set up an agreement to loan Germany money so that Germany could then use part of that money to rebuild their economy, but then also pay that money back to France and England, and then France and England could pay that money back to America. It was this weird circular system. But on top of that, America kept tariffs in place so that Europe couldn't really sell us goods, so that they were still having a hard time making money on their own. So there was just this stagnation in terms of the economy in Europe, which is why we don't have for you, those of you in 104, we don't have like a separate prosperity 20s and then Great Depression 30s era. We just have the interwar years because it's just kind of all garbage in Europe between the two world wars. So yeah, things were not great over in Europe. So here's the stock market. 1929, as you can see, it goes up and then things don't go so well. And then it starts going up again, and since this is a fairly old map, even by the time I got it, it ends at about 2000, and some stuff happens after 2000, 2005, 2009-ish. It actually ends in 2002. Yeah, some stuff happens after that. In fact, a bunch of stuff happens. We've gone through how many terrible? I've actually lost count of how many economic crises we've been through at this point. Here's what the stock market used to look like before they had all those fancy glowing Chiron things. I don't know. I don't quite understand the stock market. It just seems like a bad idea. Speaking of which, here's the Onion. Stock market invincible. Buy, buy, buy. New easy credit delays financial catastrophes until the 1930s. If you don't understand the Onion is satire, this isn't real. But it is essentially how this was treated in the 1920s. Everything is great. Throw all your money at stuff. It'll be totally fine. Stock market, the ride. Just giving you guys a little bit of a spoiler for what's coming. This one isn't the Onion. This one's real. Florida News, Real Estate Investor's Guide, the greatest real estate development in the world. The state that's mostly swamp. $50 an acre, yada, yada, yada. Here's a lady and an elephant dancing to, sell the land, I guess. I don't know. And then there's Europe owing lots of money. There's the Dawes Plan, which, required the money to circulate, and that certainly wouldn't cause any problems anywhere down the line. Right, now the social aspect of all of this. Prosperity was continuing to increase in the United States. New moral ideas came about. There was the entertainment industry that was flourishing, largely centered in Hollywood, which I'll get to in just a second. We had the idea of the new woman, dressing as flappers, wearing short skirts, and by short skirts I mean you could almost see the knee. Ample makeup, smoking cigarettes in public, drinking alcohol, which was still technically illegal, dancing to jazz on the dance floor, stuff that would still make some people clutch pearls today. All right, since this class is larger, my class yesterday didn't say anything, so let's see if I can get something out of you guys. Why did the entertainment industry move to Hollywood, which actually was called Hollywoodland at the time? Because it used to be they shot all their films in studios in New York. But then they moved to Hollywoodland in the 1910s, 1920s. And don't think about Hollywood the way it is today. Think like 100 years ago, what it may have looked like. Or just think of if you've ever seen what the area outside Hollywood looks like, where there aren't people. It's hard to imagine, huh? I'll get to the image in a minute then. So we'll talk about some entertainment first, and then I'll show you the image, even though it's kind of blurry, but you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. So getting away from Hollywood for a moment, we still had traditional values, levels of entertainment. By 1929, 40% of households had a radio. There were two major broadcasting stations, the Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS, and the National Broadcasting Company, NBC. Yes, CBS and NBC have been around forever. Advertising, racial stereotypes for entertainment because, 1920s. Foreign language channels fill the airwaves. I actually did a bit of reading on this. The 1920s were this sort of wild west of radio stations. As long as you had the capability of putting up a small radio antenna in your backyard, you could make your own radio station. There was no sorts of regulations. There were pirate radio stations were just the norm. Also, there wasn't any real differentiation between civilian radio and military radio. So during World War I, there was some issues with that. They fixed that pretty quick, but it was an issue for a little while. And then in terms of culture, also the intellectuals. A group called themselves the Lost Generation, disillusioned with the First World War. Scholars discredited racial notions of the day, challenging the idea that whites were inherently superior. They said this intellectual development was determined by environmental factors because, if you have one group that's treated well and given all the educational opportunities of the world and another group that's left in the slums and treated poorly and not given any educational opportunities, you would kind of expect one group to do better. And then Sigmund Freud was around, the idea of human subconscious, et cetera, et cetera. Most of his stuff has kind of been discredited by this point, but this did start off psychology as a proper science. So, image time. Hollywoodland. It was scrubland. It was, I wouldn't say in the desert, but it was very much almost desert. They went to Hollywood because it was cheap. It was basically nothing. And it was a whole lot cheaper to just build a sound studio in the middle of this than it was to rent one in New York. But then everyone went there. And of course, once everyone's there, the property values shoot up. So then Hollywood becomes what it is today. The Hollywoodland sign has been vandalized many times. The land bit got pushed down and they just decided to keep it that way. That's why it's just Hollywood now. Got a Captain Morgan thing going on here. Here's There's women dressed in their flapper dresses. Look, you can almost see their knees. I know this might be too much for you guys. I'm sorry. I like their little hats, too. There they are out dancing. Oh no, their knees. Ah, there they are in bathing suits with, like, calf-high socks. Wait, no, one of them's barefoot. Ah! Okay. And radios. My grandparents also had one of these. Not quite identical to this one, not like the refrigerator I showed you guys. But I love how all the old stuff was basically also a piece of furniture. So you also just like used it to put stuff on. This one was weird though. It's like, okay, children, wear your Sunday best and let's listen to the radio. Like, no, I'm going to be sitting in my freaking pajamas if we're sitting in the living room listening to the radio. What is wrong with you? Okay, little Timmy, put on your shirt and tie. Dad's going to be in a 3-piece suit. Weird ads, man. I mean, it's not that different than today when you've got, like, people walking around in their house in, like, slacks and a polo shirt. I don't know. Anyway, CBS, NBC, and this is something also, if I manage to get to the movie for us this semester, the old radio stations and even when they became television news stations, they did this whole like electricity thing because that was like the new picture. Clearly somebody said something funny because a lot of these others are reacting, and that just makes the image feel more alive to me. And I appreciate that. And then you've just got like a cafe in Paris where a lot of this thought came from. And Sigmund Freud, the like one image I ever use of him. So a group of black writers paid homage to what they considered the second generation born after 1865, so not like the children of former slaves, but the generation following that, so like the grandchildren. They were another generation removed from the era of slavery. So once again, we're still in the shadow of W.B. Du Bois. James Weldon Johnson, Chief Executive of the NAACP, said the final measure of greatness of all peoples is the amount and standard of the literature and art they have produced. So we therefore got a boom of writing, poetry, and music. Jazz and the blues came to the wider American audience. Rhythms, meaning emotional freedom, expression of sexuality. Therefore, we had lots of people being afraid of the blues and jazz. Oh no, jazz is the devil. Just like every other new form of music that ever came out ever. As far as the big individual to talk about in this section, besides Du Bois, because he's just always there, was the Jamaican-born Marcus Mosiah Garvey. He settled in Harlem, created the UNIA. Now, rather than trying to access the American dream, he had this like back to Africa idea, repatriating his people back to their homeland, which actually was not completely dissimilar from what the Klan wanted to do. Now, they were just all about segregation and violence. Obviously, Garvey didn't agree with that. But he did feel like blacks and whites shouldn't be living together. He did amass a fair bit of a following and disagreed with NAACP, saying that they were too soft. and again disagreed with them, feeling like they should be seeking for equality and togetherness isn't the right word, but like assimilation. You know, we have equal rights and we should have equal rights and equal access to the American dream. You know, segregation is not what we're looking for. He got in a lot of trouble for his shenanigans, but ended up being deported back to Jamaica after a mail fraud charge connected to his Black Star Line, the Black Star Line being his steamship line that he was using to transport people. So that kind of ended his ambitions a little bit early. So you have the NAACP. Folks in Harlem. More of this new generation. More of the new generation, much of Women in a Car, which again, for the people at the time, which we'll get into in just a minute, would have caused quite a few people concern. Of course, you got the blues, and jazz kings. There's Mr. Garvey, although this is the image that's in the book. Him with his big feather hat and military regalia. So, after the Civil War, well, technically after the Civil War, but after World War I, this shift against traditional values caused a backlash, and of course, much of it was against immigrants, especially anything that like pushed against the concept of white supremacy, because you know that's a thing. So, new round of discrimination against immigrants, especially with groups of Jewish and Catholic folks coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, especially from the newly formed Soviet Union, which wasn't real friendly to religious minorities. So we had the, I think it's Sacco, is the Italian pronunciation, Sacco and Vanzetti case. Basically, there was a botched robbery. The bookkeeper and guard were dead. These two Italian immigrants were blamed, but in the case, or in the court trial, I can't words. Rather than try to bring up evidence about them being there or them being the ones that did it, they talked more about where they were from and their ideology, as they were anarchists and draft dodgers, to rile up the court, or rather the jury, against them. They both had real good lawyers, and there was a lot of support for them. But they were both sentenced to death in the electric chair by 27. So, yeah, that was a pretty blatant just, we're going to use them as a show of us hating immigrants. Then we also have the National Origins Act, restrict immigration by any foreign group to 2% of its population in the U.S. in 1890, which sounds like a whole bunch of words. But this specifically is making sure that less Southern and Eastern Europeans can get in, because this was when we had that shift from Northwest Europe to Southeast Europe. So whatever percentage of Europeans were in America in 1980, 1880, I can't words, 1890, yeah. We can only have, a small percentage of that coming over. So mostly Northwest Europeans, mostly English and Irish and Germans and French, not Russians, I can't words, and, Greeks and Poles and all of that. So we had lots of demonstrations for Saccio Vanzetti. This is actually in England, so Trafalgar Square there, so that's in England. Coming near thousands. So here they are, Nicola Saccio and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. Saccio Vanzetti to die, death of execution set for Thursday. And this is the Industrial Worker magazine, so it actually talks about, calls this a federal lynching, death of respect for all capitalist institutions. Some of the startling evidence which Thayer and Governor Fuller says is not sufficient, but they're putting them to death anyway. And here's the immigration bill. Japanese ban becomes effective. America, land of opportunity, prosperity, freedom, but immigration quotas filled. Try next year. So here it is. 1881 to 1890, it's more than 75% Northwestern Europe. 91 to 1900, it's about half and half. And you can see 1901 to 1910, it's more than 75% Southeastern Europe. But then the law is passed here, I think it was around 1920, let me make sure, 1924. And it started to shift back. So by the 1930s to 1940, it had gone back to almost pre-1900s numbers, or at least percentages. And again, despite, send us you're tired, you're poor, etc., there was still a lot of this, just like, oh, we don't want the riff-raff immigration. It's a danger to American ideals. It's a national menace. Like, well, make up your mind. Do we want immigrants or not? Well, clearly a bunch don't, even though we need them for the economy. Oh, speaking of bad things, that. So nativism was bad, but the Ku Klux Klan was back. Former Methodist preacher W.J. Simmons, and they decided, they needed to become more diverse too. So rather than just being anti-black, they were also added Jews and Catholics to the list of targets, as well as anyone they saw as violating community morals. So they were the moral police now, but also very violent. They refounded at Stone Mountain near Atlanta, Georgia, which is still like a major Klan monument to this day for some reason. I mean, it's deep in Georgia, so obviously it's going to be left alone. They bowed to their twin symbols, the American flag and the burning cross, which represented, quote, their fiery determination to stand up for Christian morality and against all they considered un-American. By the mid-1920s, they had over 3 million men and women nationwide. Again, as I said, this was just more than hostility towards blacks. Revitalization was due to their desire to reaffirm traditional values. they saw as being threatened by immigrants because, oh no, scary people that aren't American. Well, what even is American besides the natives? But they didn't change everything. They kept their old traditions of using force, scare tactics, burning crosses, beatings, kidnappings, murder. Because if it ain't broke. But they also worked in politics. They got a number of governors and state legislators elected. Some politicians joined the Klan. Saw the Klan as a source of votes. Now, whether the politicians saw the Klan as, or agreed with the Klan or not, it's up for debate. But some people probably did, considering some of the politicians. And as we're going to see here in just a little bit, it caused some issues. So we have W.J. Simmons. Here's a Klansman being very polite. Here's a bunch of dudes having a barbecue, I guess. Now I can't see this and not think of one of the random events in Red Dead Redemption 2 where they're setting up a burning cross and setting themselves on fire because they're a bunch of idiots. It's great. Here they are marching in D.C. with their mask up because they're supported by the government, apparently. Fiery cross. Because, Rome's scary, I guess. More in D.C. More anti-Rome because apparently Rome's going to take over, I guess. I don't know what this weird, anti-Rome thing is. I mean, I'm not a Catholic, but, I don't understand the fear of the Pope. There was some political action against the Klan, but not enough. Not enough to slow them down. Speaking of oh no, my values, fundamentalism. So Protestants also believed their traditional values were being attacked. Around 1910, there were two wealthy churchgoers in Los Angeles who funded a series of pamphlets called The Fundamentals. Believed the Bible should be read literally, which, having read the Bible, is difficult. Followers of this belief were known as fundamentalists and had the strongest hold in the Southeast or the Bible Belt, which is where we all live. Further traditions were under attack. I feel like if you told anybody that lived here that fundamentalism came from two rich weirdos in Los Angeles, they would be very offended. Los Angeles, California? No. Obviously, Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species was particularly hated. Again, you still have people to this day that see it as an especially offensive thing. Intolerable that someone suggested that man descended from apes, which wasn't what it said. Apes and man descended from a common ancestor. In fact, humans are one of the great apes. 1925, Arkansas, Mississippi, Florida, Oklahoma, and Tennessee made it illegal to teach in public schools, quote, any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible. Just don't know how the hell South Carolina got out of that. Dayton, Tennessee tried to gain fame by stirring up anti-evolution fervor. This was the whole Scopes monkey trial where they had a teacher teach evolution even though it was illegal, and then had a whole trial happen to try to make the town famous, and just ended up showing how entrenched all of this was. These anti-evolution laws remained on the books until the 1970s, and we still have people to this day in government who are trying to get these laws back on the books. Oh, hey, look, they actually used the Pied Piper thing correctly. Now, granted, they're saying that, Darwinian evolution is science falsely so-called, or whatever that means, leading them off into some scary dark cave. But that's actually using the Pied Piper correctly, unlike that weird one with Uncle Sam. It's like, follow the Pied Piper. It's like, no, you don't do that. But it's good to see propaganda properly done. I appreciate it. They even have a couple little rats. Like, somebody actually read the Pied Piper and they know what they're actually freaking talking about. I appreciate that. Here we have the descent of the modernist. Christianity, Bible not infallible, man not made in God's image, no miracles, no virgin birth, no deity, no atonement, no resurrection. I feel like once you get past no deity, the rest of them are just kind of obvious. Agnosticism and then atheism. Although, by the time you get to the bottom, you have these co-reflective shades like an anime and also a mustache, and what looks like some kind of one of those flasks in one of those evaporator flasks that you have in chemistry. So, I don't know. Anti-Evolution League, held in the high school. Will you help give the students the word of God? You got lemmings leaping into the utter disbelief in God. Save our students. The lemmings thing was also made up. That was the Disney Corporation that used to do animal documentaries, like chasing the lemmings off of a cliff and filming it. Like, oh, look, the lemmings are running off cliffs because they're so stupid. Ha, ha, ha. No, that was the Disney Corporation being really freaking sadistic. Stuff's weird. Anyway, True Science, Star Wars, Blinders. There's a lot of this. Scopes Monkey Trial. They ended up convicting the teacher, but then he was acquitted. Thou shalt not think. The verdict. Here's the Onion. Scopes Monkey Trial raises a troubling question. Is science being taught in our schools? Should children be exposed to facts or reason and empirical evidence suitable school subjects? And then a nice little nod to the original Planet of the Apes over there. Scopes defended by super intelligent chimpanzee man from the future. It's Cornelius. The old Planet of the Apes from like the 70s. All right. We're near the end. So, all these cultural clashes kept the Democratic Party weak. So the Republican Party remained in power pretty much for decades. Trying to reconcile differences in traditional modern America, kept the Republican Party in power, but as financial issues began showing themselves, it was clear that they weren't quite ready to handle a financial crisis, which, to be fair, once things did fall through, I don't think really anybody was prepared for it because it was so total. The 1924 election showed just how bad things were in the Democratic Party. Some members supported prohibition and religious fundamentalism. Others opposed both prohibition and religious fundamentalism. They tried to condemn the KKK, but others wouldn't even do that because many of them were either members of the Klan or backed by the Klan. John W. Davis won the nomination, but was easily defeated by Calvin Coolidge. 1928, Al Smith went up against Herbert Hoover. Hey, look, Hoover's back. Hoover, having been in basically every federal office known to man and probably some we don't know, was one of the most popular men in America at the time, and I have the electoral map for this particular, I have the electoral map for both, and if Coolidge won in a landslide, Hoover buried Al Smith. Like, buried him and put cement over it. It was horrible. There were a couple of third-party candidates. Progressive Party, 1924. As far as, like, there's a electoral map in the book for 1924. The Progressive Party under Robert M. La Follette, he only got, in fact, I'll go ahead and bring this up. He only got Wisconsin, which was 13 electoral votes. But as far as popular votes, he got 4.6 million, which was about, actually a little better than half, 4.8 million. Did I say billion? Million. I'm dumb. Which was about half of what the next guy, John W. Davis, got. So even though he only got one state electorally, he got about half of what this guy got in terms of popular votes. However, both these two put together didn't get half of what the other guy got, so they still got stomped. But as far as, they got, together they got about 13 million together compared to the 15 million that Calvin Coolidge got as far as popular vote. So he still beat them handily, but it's just weird that, again, electorally it looks like the progressive guy wasn't even there, but in terms of popular votes, he was not doing too bad. So Coolidge, Dawes, full dinner pail. Actually, before we get to the horrible slaughter that is the 1928 electoral map, though these parties never really lasted on the national level, some of them did have staying power on the local level. So a few of them are probably kind of still around. Some of these, like, smaller parties you'll hear about if you do local elections. That's kind of where they managed to stick around. So, again, just real quick, here's 1924 where Coolidge won easily. Here's 1928. Hoover took, like, everything. Al Smith managed to get Massachusetts at least. That was like 18 votes. But yeah, it was real rough. I mean, the South didn't even completely vote for him. So it was bad. Hoover victory decisive. That's one way to say it. And then the end of the chapter. October 29th, 1929, the year my grandmother was born, stock market prices crashed. This became known as Black Tuesday. Now, this wasn't just something that came out of nowhere. This was due to everything we've been looking at this chapter. Reckless spending, buying on margin, the speculation, And this wasn't just like this one thing caused the Great Depression. It's not just like, oh, the stock market caused the Great Depression. It was the starting gun, so to speak. It was the spark, and everything that has been happening throughout the 20s had been leading up to it. The economy was powerful, but it was very, very fragile. So when it slipped, when the stock market crashed, it just all collapsed in on itself, and it couldn't pick itself back up. And because of all these interlocking systems with Europe, when America crashed, well, not just because of America crashing and pulling Europe with it, Europe was already having a hard time, and European banks began crashing around the same time. So everybody sort of fell together, so there was nobody to pull anybody else up. The only country that wasn't affected was the USSR because they weren't connected with anybody else because, they were Soviet. So these interlocking banks, credits, loans across these nations were all plunged into the Depression. And these high interest on loans kept people from being able to pull out the debt at all. Billions were lost as the stocks crashed. There's actually a lot going on this front page. Here's a guy that lost everything and just jumped out the window. There was a lot of this. Here's a pretty famous image of this guy selling his car for $100 because he just lost everything at the stock market. It's a real nice car. And here's a little squirrel saying, why didn't you save some money for the future when times were good? He says, well, I did. And you didn't just lose money if you were in the stock market. The banks all crashed too. So if you put money in the bank, your money was gone. Because the banks were in the stock market as well, which we'll see when we come back. My grandfather, until the day he died, didn't put money in the bank. His money was wrapped up in tinfoil and put in the back of the freezer. Because he didn't trust the banks. He was born right before the Great Depression happened, and he never trusted the banks. Tells me to keep going, we can't take care of our own. So to conclude, Great 20s were prosperous but shaky. All these concerns kept people distracted. And only 2.5% of Americans actually owned stock, but once it crashed, it pulled down the whole economy. You don't have to own stock to be affected by it, which again is stupid. I don't have anything to do with stock, but if the stock market crashes, it affects prices and everything. And after all this divisiveness, all this back and forth in the 20s, Americans would have to learn to work together in the Great Depression to be able to survive. So, yeah, I'll see y'all next week for the study guide. If it's not up on Blackboard right now, I'll put it up this weekend.